In the quiet sweep of Colorado's San Luis Valley, where the sky is vast and the night is long, ranches have been haunted by a chilling mystery for decades. Carcasses of livestock found drained, sliced, dissected, with no obvious culprit. This is the story of mutilations, the investigations, the lights in the sky, and the question nobody has been able to answer. Who or what is behind them? Now you see, this story is quite personal to me because I actually grew up in the San Luis Valley of Colorado. My parents' little ranch sat on the west end of the valley, right against the base of Greenhorn Mountain. And to be honest, this story was a huge part of why I became interested in the strange. Everyone I knew had stories about lights in the sky, or finding animals that had strange wounds. I had looked at neighbors' animals, cows, horses, and even some sheep that were mutilated, that had entry holes into their bodies and all their organs missing. We all did. Every kid I knew who was a rancher family out there had looked at these animals, and we all knew that it wasn't humans doing it. There's just too much weirdness around it. The way animals wouldn't touch it, the way bugs refuse to eat the carcasses, and all that I'll get into here in a bit. But if you like this kind of stuff, and you like hearing about it from somebody who's been there, why don't you give me a like and subscribe and help me out too. The San Luis Valley itself lies high and remote. Thousands of acres of ranch land, cut by sagebrush and cooled by mountain winds. It's a region of solitude, where livestock roam and where oddities tend to go unnoticed. That is, until they can no longer be ignored. Now, the first case that drew national attention here occurred in 1967. It was on a ranch in Alamosa County, and it was a horse, actually, that was found dead under really strange circumstances. The head and neck apparently flayed. There was no tissue left, just a skeletonized skull and the vertebrae. There was little to no blood at the scene at all, and there was a strong medicinal smell in the air, like chemicals. The local press had named the animal Snippy, though later research showed the mare was actually named Lady. But that's all it took. From that moment on, the valley became something of a flashpoint, not just for ranchers, but for investigators and paranormal researchers, and anybody else drawn to this sort of unexplained. Now, what makes these cases different from other animal attacks and deaths are the weird details surrounding the actual bodies that have been found. You see, according to multiple different reports and expert testimonies, these animals are usually found missing tongues, eyes, ears, reproductive organs, udders, or other parts that usually have no value to us in the commercial agricultural trades. The incisions appear surgical. They're absolutely clean cuts, no tearing, no ripping, and sometimes they're even slightly charred on the edges, as if they had been cut with a cauterizing tool or even some sort of laser. Another one of the strange details is the extremely little amount of blood at the scenes or even left in the animals' bodies when this happens. You see, I've been around cows and horses. I've seen them bleed out and be dressed in the field for processing. They have hundreds and hundreds of gallons and pounds of fluids and blood within their body that pours out through any wound. These have little. Even in cases in which entire chunks of the body are missing, or hundreds of pounds of organs and flesh are removed, there's no blood on scene, no pools left on the ground. And aside from the body itself, in these mutilation cases, there's no signs of anything moving these animals. There's no tracks, no footprints, no tire marks or drag marks on the ground. There's no tracks of predators or anything else that would suggest some kind of human intruder. The animals simply are dropped where they happen to be found. And sometimes, in fact most times, there are strange lights reported around the vicinity, or UFO reports that come in later that relate to that same night. And for those people who first discovered the scene of Lady the horse, the horror was visceral. Her body was draped across the sagebrush, flat and meticulously worked over. and then left with no trace of how or why. Their minds reached for answers. Investigators came out and combed over the area, but nobody found any evidence to ever give a satisfactory explanation. The phenomenon didn't stay local for long. In the 1970s, waves of similar livestock deaths swept across the American West. States like Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, New Mexico, they all found themselves battling with cases of mutilated animals. But the San Luis Valley found itself at the epicenter. During 1975 alone, Colorado reported nearly 200 cases of animal mutilation. Ranchers, law enforcement agencies, and other state officials scrambled. The Federal Bureau of Investigations maintained a file titled Animal/Cattle Mutilation and covered 1974 to 1978. In fact, one memo noted that while dozens of reports came in, the Bureau lacked jurisdiction unless the incident occurred on tribal or federal lands. Locally over the decades, ranchers have become simply more and more frustrated in the events themselves, and frustrated with the investigations afterwards. In fact, one southern Colorado rancher in 2009 said that he had found 4 calves dead, all of which were missing ears, tongues, genitals, and had no signs of tracks or blood. Investigators themselves were at crossroads. Could this be some kind of unknown predator? A human cult, perhaps? Or was it truly aliens? Or something else? Something like our own government performing experiments? Much of the official conclusions lean towards predators and scavenger activity, regardless of what the evidence actually showed on the bodies and on the ground. And for many of the ranchers, that answer felt like a slap in the face. So what could be the possible causes? Over the decades, there have been 4 main categories that have emerged. Number 1 is the theory of natural predators and scavengers. It's the simplest explanation. Coyotes, vultures, insects. Decomposition might account for some of the deaths and some of the things we see on the bodies. But the skeptics of this theory, and anybody who's seen the bodies, argue that once an animal dies, tissue is ripped, it's devoured, the blood pools and stains, it doesn't disappear. And that explanation totally disregards the clean cuts, 0 tracks, and no signs of consumption or predation. So I, along with any others, simply chalked that one out. Number 2 is the human involvement. Some investigators, and even the FBI, had considered cult activity, ranch intruders, or even some sort of secret euthanasia and government testing. The early work by the FBI actually noted and flagged several cases as potential cult activity in the early 70s, but even those investigations fizzled out and really never went anywhere. Number 3 is our own government or some sort of secret human program. A bunch of ranchers and other people in the area claim that there's often unmarked helicopters that hover around at night, and especially on the nights when these things happen. And there's even a couple cases during the early 80s where residues of a potential sedative had been found along some of the animals. And number 4, of course, is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And in this we'll just include other unknown forces. You see, for some, the puzzle pieces of drained blood, surgical-like laser cuts, strange lights all point to an otherworldly intervention or explanation. Investigation books on mutilations often appeal to this. While I'm talking about this, I'm reminded of my first time as a young man watching Linda Moulton Howe's documentary on it, A Strange Harvest. I remember watching it thinking to myself, I know the ranch they're on. I can recognize those pastures in the background. And everybody, out there at least, thought it was related to UFOs or aliens. The other explanations were too prosaic. They didn't account for all the details. And the only one that truly did was the extraterrestrial hypothesis. As far as the predator theory goes, the simple lack of tracks, lack of blood, and clean incisions, scratch that out. The missing body parts of little value or the way they are missing. Scratch out that theory and do away with anything that we would see or consider typical predator behavior. The human theory runs up against simple logistics. How do you move 1,000-pound or 1,500-pound or 2,000-pound cow or bull and then take the whole carcass quietly across miles and miles of high desert, leaving no tracks, no blood, no equipment? It simply doesn't make sense. The government program, that could work, but we simply run into denial and evidence gaps. Which leads us with what may be the most speculative theory, but really the only one that truly lines up with the evidence, and that is the alien theory, the extraterrestrial or unknown visitors theory. Now, I really need to note here that not every case of an animal mutilation is a case of high strangeness. One of the main investigators, Chris O'Brien, reported after investigating about 200 different cases in the San Luis Valley that many of them in the region, in fact he estimates about 20%, are what he considered highly unusual, meaning there is no obvious signs of death, there's no obvious signs of human or animal interaction. And then he said there was another 8 or 9% that what he called totally unexplainable, meaning there is zero evidence that would give us any sort of conventional explanation at all. Zero tracks found, zero residues or markings on the body that would allow us to distinguish any kind of tool or means of doing the mutilation. And in March of 1998, while I was living here, one of those totally unexplained cases happened. A rancher found a young calf that was missing its front right leg. Its brain and the entire spinal column had been removed from its neck all the way down through its hips. Yet there was no break in its cranium. The skull was perfectly intact. There's no blood, and the area was saturated with a strong medicinal or chemical smell. Later, 2 witnesses reported that there were strange lights hovering over the ranch that night, and even the veterinarians had no explanation, 2 of which visited the ranch. One was our personal vet for our horses and our cows and sheep. They had no explanations for any of it, for how the animal got to where it was, how the bones had been removed without disrupting the other tissue or other skeletal structures, or how the brain had been sucked out of the back of the skull without making any marks or holes into it. It was another one of these cases that were simply unexplainable. And these things unnerve people. I mean, imagine opening your gate, traveling down a little dirt gravel road at dawn, and stepping into the cold air to see one of your baby calves, intact, except for its disappeared backbone, its brain gone, and its body being totally pristine outside of the obvious horrific injuries. And then nobody's left to ask, who did this or how did it happen? Where did it go, or why? I knew people who had been unnerved by it, who had been hurt and traumatized emotionally, who had cried with their children because their animals that they needed to show for 4-H had been killed and butchered by some unknown thing. For the ranchers, this isn't sensationalism or attention-seeking for some kind of book sales or clicks. It's loss, it's fear, it's real financial ruin. In fact, one rancher, a guy who lived right near me, Mr. Manuel Sanchez, he ruled out every other explanation because his calves kept being butchered. And finally, after losing so many, he simply sold out. He sold the rest of his herd and decided to back out of ranching and leased out the rest of his land to other people because he couldn't deal with the fact that at any moment he could walk into his pasture and find another one of his babies cut apart with no signs and no answers. For the people who lived in the San Luis Valley, the people who actually had to deal and live with the mutilations and the phenomenon, it became more than just woven into our local lore. A tourist site was built at the UFO watchtower, and it was made to be one part lookout and one part memorial to the stories of lights, the unseen watchers, and the carcasses that didn't make any sense. But the most unnerving part of this entire phenomenon are the things we don't know. The whys. Why choose parts of little value? Why leave no blood? Why leave no tracks? And who or what can move across this great open plain, taking what it wants from animals and disappearing into the emptiness? In the end, when it comes to the mutilation phenomenon, the greatest terror isn't from what we can see, but what we can't. Because the valley remembers, and it keeps its secrets close.